December 7, 1941. As Japanese carrier aircraft returned from their devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, the mood aboard the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier fleet was electric with triumph. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's strike force had achieved complete tactical surprise, sunk or damaged 8 American battleships, destroyed nearly 200 aircraft, and killed over 2,400 Americans. The operation had been a stunning success, executed with precision that demonstrated Japanese naval aviation superiority. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the first wave of attacks, was already being celebrated as a national hero. In the ready rooms of the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, pilots toasted their victory with sake, convinced they had crippled American naval power for at least 2 years, possibly longer. They had no idea they had just guaranteed their own destruction. The strategic calculation behind the Pearl Harbor attack was straightforward in Japanese military thinking. America had 7 aircraft carriers in December 1941. Japan had 10 fleet carriers, giving them numerical superiority in the weapon system that would dominate Pacific naval warfare. By destroying the American battleship fleet at Pearl Harbor, Japan believed they had secured an even more decisive advantage. The plan was to use this window of superiority to conquer the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, establish a defensive perimeter across the Pacific, and force America to negotiate a peace settlement that recognized Japanese conquests. The entire strategy rested on the assumption that America lacked either the will or the capability to rebuild naval power fast enough to challenge Japanese dominance. Both assumptions would prove catastrophically wrong. What Japanese planners failed to understand was that America had already begun a massive naval expansion program before Pearl Harbor. The Two-Ocean Navy Act, passed by Congress in July 1940, authorized construction of dozens of new warships, including multiple aircraft carriers. The attack on Pearl Harbor didn't start American naval production. It accelerated a program that was already underway and removed any remaining political constraints on military spending. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, American shipyards that had been working at a measured peacetime pace shifted to emergency wartime production. Factories that built components for commercial ships retooled for military production. Tens of thousands of workers who had been building merchant vessels or working in other industries were recruited and trained for warship construction. The industrial mobilization that would ultimately doom Japan was already beginning, even as Japanese pilots celebrated their victory. The first major carrier engagement after Pearl Harbor came in May 1942 at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Japanese forces advancing toward Port Moresby in New Guinea were intercepted by American carriers. The battle was tactically confusing, with both sides launching strikes that achieved mixed results. When the engagement ended, the Japanese had sunk the American fleet carrier Lexington and damaged Yorktown. The Americans had sunk the light carrier Shoho and damaged the fleet carrier Shokaku, with Zuikaku's air group so depleted it was temporarily non-operational. Japanese commanders evaluated this as a tactical victory. They had sunk a fleet carrier and damaged another while losing only a light carrier. The mathematical balance seemed to favor Japan. American carriers available for operations had decreased from 4 to 2, while Japanese carrier strength remained substantial. What the Japanese didn't realize was that their victory was illusory. They were winning tactical engagements while losing the strategic war. June 1942 brought the Battle of Midway, the engagement that would be remembered as the turning point of the Pacific War. Japanese Admiral Yamamoto planned to lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle, where Japanese superiority in numbers and pilot experience would destroy American naval power once and for all. The plan was elaborate, involving multiple task forces and a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands. Japanese intelligence believed the Americans had at most 2 carriers available. In reality, American codebreakers had deciphered Japanese naval communications, and Admiral Nimitz knew exactly where and when the Japanese would attack. The Americans had 3 carriers waiting in ambush: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, which had been repaired in an impossibly short 48 hours after being damaged at Coral Sea. The battle unfolded with dramatic swings of fortune that have been analyzed in countless books and documentaries. What matters for understanding the production war is what happened on the morning of June 4, 1942. American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown, arriving at the Japanese fleet at the perfect moment when Japanese carriers were vulnerable with aircraft being rearmed on their decks, scored devastating hits. Within 5 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were burning wrecks. Later that day, Hiryu was also destroyed. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, representing years of construction and the core of Japanese striking power, were gone. Japan had started the war with 10 fleet carriers. They had now lost 4 of their best in a single day. The pilots, the mechanics, the ordnance handlers, the experienced crews who had trained together for years, most of them died with their ships. These losses were absolutely irreplaceable. Japanese naval leadership initially tried to conceal the magnitude of the disaster from the Japanese public and even from much of their own military. The official story downplayed Japanese losses while exaggerating American casualties. Some Japanese officers convinced themselves that while Midway had been a setback, it wasn't decisive. Japan still had 6 fleet carriers available. America had lost Yorktown at Midway and Lexington at Coral Sea, leaving them with just 4 fleet carriers. The numerical balance still seemed manageable. Japanese shipyards were already at work on new carriers. Veteran pilots had survived and could train new recruits. The war would continue and Japan would adapt. This assessment was based on fundamentally flawed assumptions about American industrial capacity. What Japanese planners didn't know, what they couldn't allow themselves to believe, even when intelligence reports tried to tell them, was what was already happening in American shipyards. The Essex-class fleet carrier program had been authorized in 1940 and construction had begun on the first ships before Pearl Harbor. These were not small ships or emergency conversions. They were purpose-built fleet carriers displacing over 27,000 tons, capable of carrying over 90 aircraft, incorporating all the lessons learned from earlier carrier designs. They were also being built using mass production techniques that American industry had perfected. Multiple shipyards were constructing Essex-class carriers simultaneously. The first ship, USS Essex herself, had been laid down in April 1941. By mid-1942, 9 Essex-class carriers were under construction at various stages of completion. The first would be commissioned in December 1942, just 6 months after Midway. More would follow at an accelerating pace. Japanese naval intelligence received reports about American carrier construction and systematically underestimated what they were hearing. When reports indicated that America was building more than 20 fleet carriers, Japanese analysts dismissed this as propaganda or misunderstanding. Perhaps the Americans were counting old carriers, or planned carriers that would take years to complete, or conversions of merchant ships rather than purpose-built fleet carriers. The idea that America could actually construct 20 or more fleet carriers in just a few years seemed to violate basic principles of naval construction. Building a fleet carrier was an enormously complex undertaking, requiring specialized facilities, thousands of skilled workers, sophisticated equipment, and years of construction time. Japanese shipyards, working at maximum capacity, could perhaps build 2 or 3 fleet carriers in a year. The notion that American shipyards could build 6 or 8 in the same period seemed absurd. But American shipyards weren't working by Japanese rules or Japanese methods. American naval construction had been revolutionized by applying industrial production techniques to shipbuilding. Prefabrication of major components, modular construction, parallel production of sub-assemblies, standardized designs that allowed workers to become expert at specific tasks, massive investment in workforce training, these methods allowed American shipyards to build carriers faster than anyone thought possible. The Norfolk Navy Yard, Newport News, Shipbuilding, Brooklyn Navy Yard, Philadelphia Navy Yard, and other facilities were all building carriers simultaneously. Workers labored in multiple shifts around the clock. Components arrived from factories across the country via a logistics network that ensured materials were available when needed. The system was designed for speed and volume, and it worked. The numbers started becoming undeniable by late 1943. USS Essex, commissioned in December 1942. USS Yorktown, named for the carrier lost at Midway, commissioned in April 1943. USS Intrepid in August 1943. USS Hornet in November 1943. USS Lexington in February 1944. Month after month, new Essex-class carriers joined the fleet. Each one was more capable than the Japanese carriers they replaced. Each one arrived with full air groups of modern aircraft. Each one was supported by logistics that ensured fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and everything else needed for sustained operations. By mid-1944, America had more fleet carriers in the Pacific than Japan had possessed at the start of the war. And more were coming. Japan's shipbuilding response was hampered by factors that went far beyond simple industrial capacity. Resources that might have gone to building carriers instead went to building battleships, because Japanese naval doctrine still emphasized big gun ships despite carriers having proven decisive. The super battleships Yamato and Musashi, magnificent but strategically useless, consumed resources that could have built multiple carriers. When Japan did build carriers, construction was slow because Japanese shipyards used traditional methods that didn't scale well. Design changes and improvements, which Japanese engineers insisted on implementing, disrupted production and slowed completion. Workforce shortages became critical as men were conscripted for the army. American submarine attacks on Japanese merchant shipping meant that raw materials became scarce. Bombing attacks, while less extensive than those against Germany, still disrupted production. The reality hit home at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, 2 years almost to the day after Midway. The Japanese Navy committed essentially everything it had left to stopping the American invasion of the Mariana Islands. The Japanese force included 9 aircraft carriers with about 450 aircraft. They faced an American force of 15 carriers with over 900 aircraft. The numerical disparity was so severe that the outcome was practically predetermined. American fighter direction officers, using radar to track incoming Japanese strikes, vectored interceptors to optimal positions. American fighters, now flying superior F-6F Hellcats rather than the older F-4F Wildcats, systematically destroyed Japanese formations. By the end of what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japan had lost approximately 350 aircraft and 3 carriers. American losses were minimal, around 30 aircraft mostly to operational accidents. Japanese Admiral Ozawa, commanding the carrier force at Philippine Sea, had believed his force could inflict serious damage on the American fleet, despite being outnumbered. He had tactical advantages, including longer-range aircraft that could strike first, and he planned to use land-based aircraft from Guam to supplement his carrier forces. But none of it mattered. The American material advantage was so overwhelming that Japanese tactical planning became irrelevant. When Ozawa's surviving carriers limped away from the battle, Japanese naval aviation had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The carriers themselves survived initially, but without aircraft and trained pilots, they were just targets. Most would be sunk in the following months. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had begun the war with the world's most powerful carrier force, had been reduced to impotence by an American industrial machine that produced carriers faster than Japan could sink them. The psychological impact on Japanese naval officers who understood what had happened must have been crushing. They had started the war confident in their superiority. They had achieved stunning victories in the first 6 months. Then came Midway, which they told themselves was a recoverable setback. But the defeats kept coming, and each time the Americans came back stronger. Every Japanese carrier lost was gone forever, representing years of construction that couldn't be repeated. Every American carrier sunk was replaced by 2 or 3 new ones within months. The mathematics of carrier production had doomed Japan before the first shot was fired, but Japanese leadership either couldn't see it or refused to accept it until far too late. The Essex-class production program's final numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Between 1942 and 1946, American shipyards completed 24 Essex-class fleet carriers. 24 full-sized fleet carriers, each capable of carrying 90 to 100 aircraft, each representing the cutting edge of naval aviation technology. The construction time for each carrier decreased as production progressed and shipyard workers became more experienced. Early Essex-class ships took about 20 months from keel laying to commissioning. Later ships took as little as 14 to 15 months. American industry had turned aircraft carrier construction into something approaching mass production, an achievement that would have seemed impossible in 1941. Japan, by contrast, completed exactly 6 fleet carriers during the entire war period, and several of those were conversions of other ship types rather than purpose-built carriers. But the Essex-class fleet carriers were only part of the story. American shipyards were simultaneously building Independence-class light carriers, which were converted from cruiser hulls but still carried 30-40 aircraft each. 9 Independence-class carriers were commissioned between 1943 and 1944, adding further to American striking power. These light carriers were faster to build than fleet carriers and provided additional flexibility for task force operations. Japanese forces encountering American carrier task forces in 1944 might face 2 or 3 fleet carriers plus 1 or 2 light carriers in a single formation, representing over 300 aircraft in one striking group. Japan had nothing that could contest such overwhelming force. The escort carrier program added another dimension to American naval dominance. These were small carriers built on merchant ship hulls, designed primarily for anti-submarine warfare and providing air cover for convoys and amphibious operations. They carried only 20-30 aircraft and weren't intended to fight fleet actions against enemy carriers. But they freed up fleet carriers for offensive operations by handling tasks that would otherwise have required fleet carriers. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards built 122 escort carriers. 122. The number is so large it almost loses meaning. Japan built no escort carriers at all. The concept didn't fit Japanese naval doctrine, which emphasized decisive fleet battles rather than the unglamorous work of protecting convoys and supporting ground operations. Japanese submarine warfare against American shipping achieved minimal success partly because American escort carriers made submarine operations increasingly dangerous. Japanese submarines, which were designed primarily to attack warships rather than merchant vessels, found themselves hunted by aircraft from escort carriers that accompanied American convoys. The submarines that had been supposed to attenuate American naval power became hunted rather than hunters, forced to operate cautiously and achieving little strategic effect. Meanwhile, American submarines operating with increasing effectiveness as the war progressed, devastated Japanese merchant shipping and even hunted Japanese warships. The asymmetry in naval warfare extended beyond carriers to every aspect of maritime operations. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 represented Japan's last attempt to use surface naval forces to achieve strategic results. The plan was complex and desperate, involving multiple task forces attempting to attack American amphibious forces landing in the Philippines. The Japanese committed 4 aircraft carriers to the operation, but these carriers had only 108 aircraft among them, barely more than a single American fleet carrier's air group. The Japanese carriers were decoys, meant to lure American fast carriers away from the landing beaches so Japanese battleships could attack the vulnerable amphibious ships. The plan failed catastrophically. American carriers, now operating in overwhelming numbers with complete air superiority, destroyed what remained of Japanese naval aviation and sank all 4 Japanese carriers along with multiple battleships and cruisers. It was the largest naval battle in history, and it ended with the Japanese Navy reduced to scattered remnants incapable of affecting the war's outcome. By early 1945, the strategic situation was beyond redemption for Japan. American carriers operated off the Japanese coast with virtual impunity, launching strikes against Japanese cities and military installations. Japanese defenders could mount only token resistance. The few remaining Japanese carriers were in port, unable to operate due to lack of fuel, ill aircraft or trained pilots. Some were reduced to floating anti-aircraft platforms. Others were simply abandoned as useless. The Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull into what should have been the world's largest aircraft carrier, was sunk by an American submarine on her maiden voyage in November 1944, having never launched a single aircraft in combat operations. The ship symbolized the futility of Japanese naval construction in the face of American industrial supremacy. The human cost of this industrial imbalance was measured in tens of thousands of Japanese sailors and aviators who died in a losing fight against overwhelming material superiority. Japanese carrier crews, who began the war as members of an elite force, superbly trained and equipped with excellent ships, ended the war watching their carriers being systematically destroyed while American carriers darkened the horizon. Japanese naval aviators, who had been among the best in the world in 1941, were by 1944 being shot down by inexperienced American pilots flying superior aircraft in numbers that made individual skill irrelevant. The bravery and professionalism of Japanese naval personnel couldn't overcome the fundamental strategic error of starting a war against an opponent with 10 times their industrial capacity. The architects of Japanese naval strategy had based their plans on assumptions that were flawed from the beginning. They assumed American industrial capacity, while substantial, couldn't be focused on military production quickly enough to matter. They assumed American will to fight would collapse after early defeats. They assumed Japanese tactical superiority and fighting spirit would offset material disadvantages. They assumed a short war ending in negotiated peace favorable to Japan. Every single assumption proved wrong. American industry mobilized with stunning speed. American will to fight strengthened rather than weakened after Pearl Harbor. American tactical skill improved rapidly through combat experience, while Japanese advantages eroded. And the war continued until Japan was completely defeated, with unconditional surrender the only option. Admiral Yamamoto, who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, reportedly said that he could run wild for 6 months to a year, but had no confidence in ultimate victory if the war lasted longer. He understood that Japan couldn't win a prolonged industrial war against America. His pessimism proved entirely justified. Japan won stunning victories in the first 6 months of war, exactly as Yamamoto predicted. Then American industrial production began reaching the front lines, and everything changed. Yamamoto himself was killed in April 1943, when American fighters, guided by intelligence from codebreakers, intercepted and shot down his aircraft over Bougainville. He died before seeing just how completely American production would overwhelm Japanese forces, but he had understood the fundamental equation well enough to know Japan's position was hopeless. The logistics supporting American carrier operations in the Pacific deserve emphasis because they represented another area where American organizational skill and industrial capacity created insurmountable advantages. Operating carriers thousands of miles from American bases required a supply chain of breathtaking complexity. Each carrier needed aviation fuel, bombs, torpedoes, ammunition for dozens of aircraft and the ship's own weapons, spare parts for aircraft and ship systems, food for thousands of crew members, and countless other supplies. Multiply this by the dozen or more carriers operating simultaneously. Add in the supporting battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, and you have logistical requirements that would have broken less sophisticated supply systems. American logistics met these requirements through systematic planning and massive investment in support infrastructure. Fleet oilers could refuel carriers at sea, eliminating the need to return to port when fuel ran low. Ammunition ships could rearm carriers and their escorts during operations. Repair ships could fix battle damage or mechanical problems without requiring ships to steam thousands of miles back to major shipyards. The floating logistics base that supported American carrier task forces was itself a marvel of organization that Japanese forces never came close to matching. Japanese carriers that needed fuel or ammunition often had to break off operations and return to port, sacrificing operational flexibility and giving American forces time to respond. American carriers could remain on station for weeks at a time, maintaining relentless pressure. The training infrastructure supporting American carrier operations was similarly impressive and similarly unmatched by Japanese equivalents. By 1943, the United States had established a complete pipeline for creating carrier-capable pilots, aircrew, mechanics, and support personnel. Training carriers operated in safe waters, allowing newly trained air groups to practice carrier operations before deploying to combat zones. This meant that when new carriers joined the fleet, they arrived with air groups that were already proficient in carrier takeoffs and landings, the most dangerous aspects of carrier aviation. Japanese training programs, hampered by fuel shortages and lack of safe training areas, couldn't provide equivalent preparation. Japanese pilots increasingly arrived at operational carriers with minimal carrier experience, leading to accidents and operational losses that further degraded Japanese capability. The technological evolution of American carrier aircraft during the war showed how American industrial capacity enabled continuous improvement even during mass production. The F-4F Wildcat, America's primary carrier fighter at the start of the war, was adequate but inferior to the Japanese Zero in many respects. By 1943, the F-6F Hellcat was replacing the Wildcat in frontline service. The Hellcat was faster, more heavily armed, more durable, and better suited to American tactical doctrine than the Wildcat. It couldn't outturn a Zero in a dogfight, but it didn't need to because it could use superior speed and firepower to attack and disengage at will. The Hellcat achieved a kill ratio of approximately 19-1 against Japanese aircraft, a statistic that reflected both the aircraft's quality and the declining skill level of Japanese pilots. American dive bombers and torpedo bombers underwent similar evolution. The SBD Dauntless dive bomber, which had sunk 4 Japanese carriers at Midway, was supplemented and eventually replaced by the SB-2C Helldiver, which carried heavier bomb loads and had better performance. The TBF Avenger torpedo bomber, which replaced the disastrous TBD Devastator, became increasingly effective as torpedo technology improved and as American pilots developed better tactics. By 1944, American carrier air groups were equipped with aircraft that were superior to their Japanese equivalents in almost every measurable way, and they were available in numbers that made Japanese resistance futile. Japanese aircraft development, hampered by resource shortages and competing priorities, failed to keep pace. The Zero remained in frontline service throughout the war, despite being increasingly obsolescent. Attempts to develop successor aircraft either failed or produced designs that arrived too late and in too few numbers to affect outcomes. The shortage of high-octane aviation fuel meant that even when Japan developed more powerful engines, they couldn't produce fuel that would allow those engines to operate at maximum performance. Japanese aircraft that looked impressive on paper often performed disappointingly in combat because they lacked the fuel quality, the pilot training, the maintenance support, or the tactical doctrine needed to use them effectively. The kamikaze strategy, introduced in October 1944, represented Japan's admission that conventional carrier aviation could no longer contest American naval power. If Japanese pilots couldn't survive long enough to develop combat proficiency, if Japanese aircraft were so outmatched that achieving hits with bombs or torpedoes was nearly impossible, then perhaps converting aircraft into guided missiles flown by suicide pilots could achieve results that orthodox tactics couldn't. The kamikaze strategy was born of desperation, a recognition that Japan had lost the carrier war so completely that only suicidal tactics offered any hope of inflicting significant casualties. The strategy was horrifying and did inflict serious damage, particularly on smaller vessels like destroyers and destroyer escorts. But it couldn't change strategic realities. American shipyards could replace losses faster than kamikazes could sink ships, and American defensive measures improved rapidly as experience was gained. The philosophical difference between Japanese and American approaches to carrier warfare became starkest in this final phase. Japan had started the war with the world's most experienced carrier pilots, men who had trained for years and fought in China. These elite aviators were considered irreplaceable national assets. Yet Japanese strategic planning sent them into battles where losses were inevitable and replacements were inadequate. By 1944, the elite pilots were mostly dead, and their replacements had a few weeks of training before being sent into combat where they died quickly without achieving much. The kamikaze strategy simply formalized what had already become reality. Japanese pilots were dying on their first or second missions anyway, so why not design tactics around that reality? It was a rational adaptation to an impossible situation, but it represented complete strategic failure. American carrier aviation, by contrast, valued pilots but understood they were producible resources like aircraft or ammunition. American training programs produced thousands of qualified carrier pilots. Some died in combat, but the system generated replacements faster than casualties occurred. By 1944, American carrier pilots were often more experienced than their Japanese opponents because the American system kept them alive long enough to learn. American pilots who survived their first few missions often went on to accumulate dozens of successful combat missions, developing into veterans whose experience made them even more effective. The longer the war continued, the more experienced American pilots became, while Japanese pilot quality continued declining. The mathematical curve of experience versus attrition favored America completely. The final accounting of carrier production numbers is almost absurd in its disparity. Japan began the war with 10 fleet carriers, built 6 more during the war, and converted several other vessels into light carriers or escort carriers, for a total of perhaps 20 carrier-capable ships across all categories. America began the war with 7 fleet carriers, built 24 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and 122 escort carriers, for a total of 162 carriers of all types. America built more than 8 times as many carriers as Japan. Even if you count only fleet carriers, America built 4 times as many as Japan's entire carrier construction program. The production disparity was so enormous that Japanese defeat was essentially guaranteed once American shipyards reached full production capacity. The economic costs tell a similar story. The United States spent approximately $3 billion on carrier construction during World War II. Japan spent less than a tenth of that amount. But even these figures understate the disparity because American carriers were generally larger, more capable, and better equipped than Japanese equivalents. An Essex-class carrier displaced 27,000 tons and carried 90 to 100 aircraft. Japanese fleet carriers averaged smaller with fewer aircraft. The American carriers also incorporated damage control systems, radar, communications equipment, and other technologies that Japanese carriers either lacked or had in less sophisticated forms. American carriers were simply better ships, built in far greater numbers, supported by superior logistics, and operated by better-trained crews using better aircraft. There was no dimension of carrier warfare where Japan had sustainable advantages by 1943. The human dimension of this industrial mismatch deserves final emphasis. Thousands of Japanese sailors and aviators died serving on carriers or flying from them, fighting bravely in a war their nation couldn't win. The crews of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu who died at Midway were skilled professionals doing their duty. The pilots who flew increasingly suicidal missions in 1944 and 1945 were brave young men serving their country. Their sacrifice was real and their courage undeniable. But they were fighting for a strategic cause that was hopeless from the beginning. Japanese naval personnel weren't defeated because they lacked skill or courage or dedication. They were defeated because their nation's industrial base couldn't compete with American production, and their leadership started a war without understanding this fundamental reality. American carrier crews faced their own dangers and hardships. Carrier aviation was inherently dangerous even without enemy action. Landing accidents, mechanical failures, and operational mistakes killed thousands of American aviators during the war. Combat added to the toll, with Japanese defenders inflicting significant casualties even as they were being overwhelmed. American carrier sailors worked exhausting schedules in difficult conditions, operating complex machinery in combat zones for months at a time. Their contribution to victory was hard-won and costly, but they had the immense psychological advantage of knowing they were winning, that their sacrifices were part of a successful strategy, that the war was being won despite setbacks and casualties. This knowledge didn't make combat less dangerous or frightening, but it provided purpose and confidence that Japanese personnel increasingly lacked. The strategic lessons from the carrier production race influenced naval thinking for decades after the war. The importance of industrial capacity in modern warfare was demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt. Technical excellence in individual weapons, while valuable, proved less important than the ability to produce adequate weapons in overwhelming quantities. Tactical skill and fighting spirit, while necessary, couldn't overcome material disadvantages of the magnitude that Japan faced. The nation that could build 24 fleet carriers defeated the nation that could build 6. And no amount of tactical brilliance or warrior ethos could change that mathematical reality. These lessons shaped American Cold War strategy and influenced military planning globally. The specific design features that made the Essex-class carriers successful also influenced post-war carrier development. The emphasis on damage control, the open hangar design that allowed efficient aircraft operations, the sophisticated radar and communication systems, all became standard features of subsequent carrier designs. American naval architects had learned how to build effective carriers that could be produced in quantity, and these lessons informed American naval construction for the next half-century. The supercarriers that dominated American naval power during the Cold War were evolutionary descendants of the Essex class, incorporating new technologies but following the same basic design philosophy of balancing capability with producibility. For Japan, the carrier production disaster was part of a larger pattern of strategic miscalculation. Japanese leadership had convinced themselves that American society was decadent and weak, that Americans lacked the will and capability for prolonged industrial war, that Japanese spirit and tactical excellence would overcome material disadvantages. Every assumption proved catastrophically wrong. American society mobilized for total war with efficiency and determination that shocked Japanese observers. American industrial capacity, when fully mobilized, dwarfed anything Japan could achieve. American tactical skill improved rapidly through combat experience, while Japanese advantages eroded through attrition. The war ended not with a negotiated peace, but with complete Japanese defeat, atomic bombings, and unconditional surrender. Japanese admirals who survived the war and later wrote about their experiences consistently acknowledged that the carrier production race was lost before it began. Some claimed they had understood this at the time, but were overruled by political leadership that insisted on war. Others admitted they had underestimated American industrial capacity and learned their error through bitter experience. A few maintained that Japan had no choice but to fight, that American economic pressure and diplomatic demands left war as the only option to preserve Japanese sovereignty. But almost all acknowledged that once war began, American industrial production made Japanese defeat inevitable. The only question was how long Japan could prolong the fight and at what cost. The admirals who had thought Midway was a recoverable setback learned the truth through the steady stream of new American carriers that appeared in 1943 and 1944. Intelligence reports that they had dismissed as exaggerated or impossible proved accurate. American shipyards were building carriers at rates that seemed to violate basic principles of naval construction. By 1944, there were more American carriers in the Pacific than Japan had possessed at the start of the war, and more were arriving every month. Japanese carriers, once the pride of the Imperial Navy and the foundation of Japanese naval strategy, were being hunted down and sunk one by one. The survivors sat in port unable to operate for lack of fuel, aircraft, or trained pilots. By war's end, the once mighty carrier force that had struck Pearl Harbor existed only in history books and the memories of the few survivors. The broader lesson transcends naval warfare and even World War II itself. It's about the danger of strategic planning based on hopeful assumptions rather than realistic assessment of relative capabilities. Japanese leadership wanted to believe that American industrial capacity couldn't be mobilized effectively, that American will to fight would collapse quickly, that Japanese advantages in experience and fighting spirit would prove decisive. They wanted to believe these things because accepting the alternative meant acknowledging that war with America was unwinnable. So they convinced themselves of propositions that weren't supported by evidence, planned strategy around optimistic assumptions, and committed their nation to a war that killed millions and ended in absolute defeat. The Japanese admirals who celebrated after Midway, thinking they had traded unfavorably but not disastrously, didn't understand what they were facing. They counted carriers lost and carriers remaining and concluded the balance was still manageable. They didn't understand that American shipyards had already laid down keels for dozens of new carriers that would replace losses and expand the fleet far beyond pre-war levels. They didn't understand that American industry, once fully mobilized, operated at a scale that made Japanese production irrelevant. They didn't understand that they were fighting an opponent who could lose every carrier battle in 1942 and still have overwhelming carrier superiority by 1944 through sheer industrial production. By the time they understood, by the time the evidence became undeniable, it was far too late to change course. The war was already lost. All that remained was to endure until the inevitable surrender. For the pilots who had celebrated at Pearl Harbor, who had felt invincible in the opening months of war, who had believed Japanese naval aviation was supreme, the progression from triumph to disaster must have been psychologically shattering. They had started the war with the world's most powerful carrier force, flown the best carrier aircraft, and achieved victories that seemed to validate Japanese strategy. Then came Midway, the first major defeat. Then the steady attrition of 1943 as American forces gradually gained strength. Then the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in 1944, where Japanese naval aviation was effectively destroyed. Then the final humiliation of 1945, with American carriers operating off Japan with impunity, while Japanese carriers sat uselessly in port. The survivors had watched their service transformed from elite striking force to helpless victim of American industrial might. They had learned through defeat that in modern industrial warfare, the nation that can build 24 carriers defeats the nation that can build 6, regardless of tactical skill or fighting spirit. It was a hard lesson, purchased with the lives of thousands of their comrades and the destruction of everything they had been trained to protect.